Globalisation, the process or transformation of society to a state of universal interaction, does not discriminate between age, sex, or colour. The process affects men and women as equals. However, as the society we live in evolves to conform to this global change, the impact caused by authority figureheads has in turn created great division between man and women. Globalisation has not created this separation, but rather society and its inherent belief in the need for man to control is the true cause for this problem.
Women do 2/3 of the world's work, yet make up 70% of the world's 1.5 billion people living in absolute poverty. The reason for this ultimately comes down to the lack of equality for women over history and women's rights. History has shown males to be the physically dominant sex, responsible for providing for the family. These ideas have remained entrenched in society, with women being perceived to be inferior. More than 160,000 Australian women are prevented from working because they can't get childcare. Women have fought for decades to receive fairer wages and fairer working conditions. As of late 2002, only 8.2% of the directors of Australia's top 200 companies were women. Women are overrepresented in sweated labour undertaken for transnational chains, forced to work for poor wages under poor conditions. Women's total average earnings are just 66% of men's, less than they were 10 years ago. History has shown a serious lack in equality for women and has left them disadvantaged in the world of business. Too often women are forced to work under poor conditions to support children and families. Despite efforts by the UN and other human rights organisations, true equality for women, especially in the workplace, is still far from being achieved. Exploitation of women is commonplace in the 21st century and has been for centuries. Positions of power have been dominated by men, leaving women seriously disadvantaged with little opportunity to succeed.
That women's rights are human rights seems a pretty obvious statement to make. But throughout the world, women are being denied the same rights as men, and human rights are not being applied equally to men and women. The reason why the UN and many human rights groups are focusing on women is that there's a huge problem with inequality between the genders. Women are not considered equal to men. Suppression of women is embedded in many cultures and religion, even in our own culture here in Australia, although we are a developed nation. Human rights are being breached all the time by the violation of women. We hear cases about female infanticide, rape as a war tactic, rape by family members, genital mutilation, or women being sold into prostitution and slavery. In our own neighbourhood, we see the evidence of discrimination and the suppression of women. Domestic violence is also a large issue in Australian society. In fact, violence causes more deaths and disabilities worldwide amongst women aged 15 to 44 than war, cancer, malaria, or traffic accidents. It's also been found that 1 in 3 women worldwide have been beaten, coerced into sex, or abused in some way or another, most often by someone she knows. 1 in 4 of these women were abused during pregnancy. In many cases, women are not enjoying the rights to participate fully in the social and political lives and decisions of their countries. This lack of equality is in breach of human rights. The reason why the UN is using the slogan "Women's rights are human rights" is to transfer the message that women, like men, are humans and should enjoy the same basic rights.
Gender equality has widely become associated with feminism and its movements. But is it a universal human right or just another Western ideal? One would believe it to be obvious that women's rights should be human rights. Women are not alien nor defunct, they are human. Yet the lack of humanity offered to them is of great disdain. Geraldine Ferrero states, when women are casually beaten and raped and killed, as though it did not matter, they are being denied full humanity. The lighter atrocities that occur mainly in third world or developing countries include rape, slavery, genital mutilation, extreme work conditions, and forced marriages. However, inequality does not just exist in developing countries. The fact that gender equality is dubbed a Western ideal shows how far it is from being the norm. A minimum of 200 women are assaulted on a daily basis in Australia. Women are still paid less and are not top executives despite having equal education. Whilst our gender infrastructure is not as bad as developing countries, circumstances could be a lot more equal. As Pamela Bone points out, Western women are on an unstoppable path. This could be due to the feminist fighters before us, or due to the fact that we live in a liberal democratic society that thrives on hard work and ambition. The problem and distinction of equal rights lies in culture, religion and tradition. It is interesting to note that whilst Islamic countries are deemed to have the least respect and advocacy for women in their patriarchal society, their stringent dedication to the Quran should prove otherwise. For example, in divorce, the Quran states that a breach between the two, man and woman, to appoint a judge from his people and a judge from hers, and if they both desire agreement, Allah will effect harmony between them. As where Christian texts have a varied reflection, from suggesting it's a woman's fault if they are raped because women tempt men, to Jesus being the redemption of man's sin due to the degradation of women. By looking at the written word in these time-old texts and comparing them to the society that have apparently evolved from their influence, one can only wonder where the hatred and disembarkment came from. What made women inferior? Or more pointedly, why did men start to hate them? More importantly, no information from mind or text has mentioned why women should not have equal rights. Equal rights should be universal.
याद है बेटे जिससे तुम्हारा ब्याह हुआ था वो नतीजे देख चल चुका है अब तुम विधवा हो गई
The demand for gender equality that existed in Western countries in the 1960s has shifted its focus to developing nations. It is as if in all of Western Europe and North America the task of gender equality has concluded. Superficially, opportunities for men and women appear to be equal. Anti-discrimination legislation is in place to protect women from sexual harassment and gender discrimination. But I want to focus on the pervasive inequalities that still exist in the society we live in. Domestic violence against women is a preeminent example of the structural inequalities that still exist in Western societies. Policing practices and the judiciary have only very slowly shifted to accommodate an equal standard. Only very recently the extent of domestic violence became apparent, and still today criminologists suggest only a tiny proportion of crimes within the home are reported because of the stigma and shame associated with being a victim. It wasn't until 1984 that the US Attorney General's Office formally stated family violence should be recognised and responded to as a crime, and law enforcement agencies should establish arrest as the preferred response to domestic violence. In addition to this, it was arguably the pop culture revolution of protest around the time of the Vietnam War that gave momentum to the feminist movement, and this was apparent right up until the 1990s when the Spice Girls championed girl power. But there appears to be a paradox between the feminist revolution and the sexual revolution of the 1970s, when women were permitted the freedom to be hedonistic and not docile and passive sex subjects. Around the late 1990s until today, many academics have persuasively argued that the current culture of objectifying women in music and film and cosmetic surgery is evidence that possibly the sexual revolution has won this war for now. Whilst Western feminism appears to have lost momentum in the past decade, it is not possible to reverse the legislation and institutional changes that occurred during the 20th century.